The title of the third volume of Koechlin's Traité de l'Orchestration always makes me laugh. Orchestration proprement dite. In other words, after about 800 pages of introduction, finally we're getting to the real study of orchestration. What he actually means by this is that whereas up to this point we've looked at the instruments of the orchestra alone or in combination, now we'll look at orchestration from the point of view of an orchestrator who has musical ideas they want to develop with the orchestra. First, there's a very interesting chapter about general aspects of sound and timbre. The issues Koechlin covers here include unity and variety, similarity or dissimilarity of timbre, fullness and blend, ranges and tessitura, spacing of chords and textures in general, and orchestral movement. An important point here is that the orchestra is not just a way to spice up a musical idea, but rather should be an integral part of its character. This implies that the musical material itself should be worthy of and really require orchestral elaboration. While it's very easy to add colorful sounds to uninteresting musical ideas, the results may work as background music. When listened to more than once, they're not really very convincing. The next chapter lists all the different kinds of orchestral textures that Koechlin will look at. Here's the list. First, textures with more or less equal parts, like fugues, chorale writing, as in Bach. 2. Counterpoint combined with held notes in the background. 3. Melody, accompaniment, and bass. This section also includes two melodies at the same time with accompaniment, and also situations where the bass is a real counterpoint. 4. Two-part textures, either in the sense of two equal lines with no other accompaniment, or two orchestral groups in dialogue with each other. 5. Orchestration with 3 or 4 groups, each with its own material. 6. Answering phrases and dialogues along with an orchestral background. 7. Harmonic block chords. 8. Various modern textures, like motives that aren't part of larger lines, or little bits of figuration wandering around. Koechlin is aiming here at describing every kind of orchestral texture you can think of, and there are, as usual, dozens of repertoire examples for each texture, with comments. Before going into this list in detail, Koechlin starts with a short history of orchestration. He mentions the importance of Monteverdi, the first major opera composer, and then of Bach. Orchestral textures before the classical period normally don't have much doubling between instruments. Also, usually a whole movement will have one single, stable orchestration. This requires a degree of contrapuntal interest, unlike modern orchestration where the sound changes all the time. Thus, formal contrasts within the movement are usually not marked by changes of timbre. When the orchestra accompanies a choir, there's often doubling of the vocal lines, be it at the unison or in octaves, rather than independent lines. In Baroque style, a figured bass on the harpsichord or the organ serves to unify the overall texture. Then in opera, we start seeing more varied textures, often inspired by the storyline, and in the classical period, textures begin to vary much more often. When Koechlin discusses accompaniments, he goes into various kinds of background planes of tone. This is a fundamental concept in orchestration, since we can't possibly hear 80 people playing dense counterpoint at the same time. On the other hand, constant unison and octave doubling quickly becomes gray. However, if the textures are organized in various perceptual planes of tone, like melody, background harmony, background movement, and bass, there are infinite possibilities to explore. He mentions various kinds of accompaniment, like held notes, pizzicato chords, repeated notes, tremolos, arpeggios, alternation of bass and middle parts, like in a waltz, as well as more distinctive accompaniment motives, sometimes with the little touches of color at key moments. Since these various planes can be distributed between multiple families, there's enormous possible variety. When discussing foreground melodic lines, again, there are many ways to orchestrate them, ranging from solo woodwinds to octave doublings. The doubling can be entirely in one family, or for multiple families for different characters. When discussing how to orchestrate bass lines, Koechlin goes into the difference between basses on the piano, where the sound fades away, and orchestral bass lines, which often need to be sustained, which in turn can create very heavy textures. As usual, he gives a long list of possibilities. He lists 10 different ways to orchestrate a bass line. And there are also many examples of the less common techniques, like putting the bass line in the double basses alone without doubling the cellos, or having the bass note in the horns, often for a soft pedal bass. Timpani can also serve as harmonic bass. And there's also a section on how to reinforce the bass in important moments, for example to mark the arrival of a theme. An interesting comment that Koechlin makes when discussing the various textures is about the danger of seeing these categories too rigidly. There are lots of in-between situations, like alternating two other parts in a dialogue, while the inner parts have different material that only stands out occasionally. In fact, pure homophony and pure counterpoint are extremes. But in real life, there are lots of textures in between them. For example, when one inner part may be more active and interesting, but only momentarily, then going back to including a subsidiary role. The last chapter in this volume is about the musical roles that the various orchestral families can play. Whereas previously, Koechlin had looked at the instruments in technical terms and considering balance issues, here he's looking at the kinds of musical character they can provide. Of course, the list is long, since most instruments can suggest various emotions in various situations. For example, loud trombones can be terrifying, majestic, cataclysmic, as well as a way to reinforce powerful rhythms. More quietly, they can provide a very rich harmonic background when it's appropriate. There are similar discussions about the trumpets, the horns, both alone and in combination with other families. Then he moves on to the strings and the winds. Examples include things like using the strings as a source of accents, as well as the various roles the violas can play in a full texture. There are also examples of powerful crescendos and diminuendos created by adding or removing instruments. Finally, we move on to the percussion, the harp, and the piano. Like Rimsky-Korsakov, Koechlin warns against the beginner's error of using these color instruments too often, which often just makes them normal, even tiring at times. Near the end of this volume, there's an encyclopedic chapter on what the piano contributes to orchestration. First, Koechlin discusses using the piano as a member of the orchestra, that is to say, not in a concerto. If the piano has a strong attack but limited sustaining capacity, he mentions the following possibilities. Using the piano as a kind of more sonorous harp for arpeggios and moving figuration, a sort of movement to keep the texture alive, combined with wind instruments either simultaneously to accent their attacks or as partners in a dialogue, dialogues with harp, celesta, and so on, reinforcing the bass line, as a way to underline active rhythms or to reinforce accents elsewhere in the ensemble with a more percussive attack. Then he goes on to discuss various repertoire examples of these situations. Following this, he goes on to look at the piano as a soloist in a concerto. Here the questions of balance are more complicated, but it's important to note that the piano doesn't always have to be in the foreground. When in the foreground, the piano can dialogue with the orchestra using similar or contrasting material. Sometimes the piano can reply with more active figuration in a more virtuoso way. At times, the piano will have the main line, or with the main line included in more elaborate figuration. This book ends with a discussion of other types of concertos, for example for solo strings or various wind instruments.